Get comfortable. Turn the lamp down low, if it isn't already, and let your shoulders come away from your ears. Tonight I want to tell you about a woman I was afraid of for the better part of a year. I want to tell you how certain I was that she would be the one to ruin me, and how gently, how completely, I turned out to be wrong. Her name was Iris, like the flower. I know how that sounds now, soft and blue and a little old-fashioned, but for months that name sat in my chest like a cold stone. Because before I ever shook her hand, I already knew, the way you think you know things, that my mother-in-law was going to be the great villain of my life. You've heard the stories. Everyone has. The mother-in-law who rearranges your cabinets while you're at work. The one who tells your husband you're not good enough. Who shows up without calling. Who cries at the wedding for all the wrong reasons. I had heard 100 of them before I met a single soul in Ben's family. And I collected them the way a nervous person collects reasons to keep being nervous, turning each one over at night like a smooth, cold coin. So let me back up, because the fear didn't come from nowhere, and neither did the ending. Both of them have roots, and if you'll stay with me a while, I'll show you how a story I thought was going to be about survival turned out, in the end, to be about being found. My name is Rachel. When all of this happened, I was 29 years old, and I worked at a plant nursery on the edge of a small town in the mountains of western North Carolina. I spent my days with my hands in soil, talking to people about their tomatoes and their hydrangeas, telling them which corner of the yard would give a thing enough light to live. I was good at knowing what a plant needed. I could look at a sad, droopy fern somebody had half killed and tell them exactly what it was starving for. People were harder. People I could never read half so well. I was hardest on myself, mostly, and that went back to a thing that happened when I was 17. That was the year I lost my mother. Her name was Maggie. She got sick in the fall, and she was gone by spring, and it happened so fast that the whole thing still feels, all these years later, like a door slamming in a house where you thought you lived alone. My mother cooked. That's the piece of her I miss in my hands, if that makes any sense. Our little kitchen was always warm and always a mess, and she sang while she worked, off-key, and she taught me to stir and to taste and to not be afraid of a hot pan. After she died, I stopped. I didn't decide to. I just found that I couldn't stand in a kitchen and make anything real without her there. So for 12 years I lived on cereal and takeout and toast. And I told myself I wasn't a cook, when the truth was closer to grief than to talent. My father was already a quiet, faraway kind of man before all that, and afterward he got quieter and farther away. The way some people do when sorrow asks more of them than they have to give. He didn't leave exactly, he just receded, like a tide that forgot to come back in. By the time I was 20, I had learned a lesson that I carried around like a river stone in my pocket, turning it over and over with my thumb. The lesson was this: love the people you have, but don't lean. Doors close. Be ready when they do. So I built a small, careful life, and I didn't lean. And it worked, in the way that not leaning always works. It kept me upright, and it kept me lonely. And I had decided somewhere along the way that those were the only two options a person got, and that lonely was the safer of the two. And then a tall, slow-talking carpenter named Ben walked into the nursery on a Tuesday in April, looking for a redbud tree to plant for his mother's birthday. And he asked me 40 questions about root balls and clay soil, and he stayed a full hour past the point where he'd found what he came for. Ben built things. He and his father ran a little cabinet shop 2 counties over, the kind of place that smelled like sawdust and coffee and did honest work for folks who wanted a kitchen to last 30 years. He had big, careful hands and a habit of listening that made you feel like the only thing happening in the room. He came back to the nursery the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and it took me 3 Tuesdays to understand that a man does not need that many redbud trees, and that he was coming for me. He was the first person in a long time I found myself leaning toward before I remembered not to. Our first real date, he cooked. He made a terrible, wonderful pot of chili in his little rented house and burned the cornbread, and wasn't the least bit sorry about it. And I laughed more that night than I had in a year, and something in me that had been holding its breath since I was 17 let a little of it out. We were together a year before he asked me to marry him. On a cold, clear night on the tailgate of his truck, with the whole valley of town lights laid out below us. He didn't get down on one knee. He just took my hand and said he wanted to build a life the way he built everything, slow and solid and meant to last. And would I let him build it with me? I said yes before he'd finished the sentence, and then I cried, and he thought it was happiness. Most of it was, but some of it, if I'm honest, was pure fear. Because saying yes to Ben meant saying yes to a mother, and I had not had one of those in a very long time. Here is where the warnings started, and I want you to notice how ordinary they were, because that's how these things always begin. It's never one big alarm bell. It's a dozen small ones, none of them quite loud enough on its own to argue with. All of them together loud enough to keep you up at night. The first came from Ben's cousin's wife, Brittany, at the little engagement supper his family threw. She got me alone by the drinks table, put a warm hand on my forearm, and said, low and confiding, like she was doing me the biggest favor of my life, "I just want you to be prepared, honey. Iris is a lot. We had a real falling out a few years back, and I have never once felt welcome in that house since. Watch yourself around her. She smiles at you, but she is keeping score. Trust me. I learned the hard way so you don't have to." I thanked her. I remember thanking her, the way you thank someone for handing you something heavy you never asked to carry and now can't put down. And then I carried it, because that is what you do with a warning like that. Out to the car and all the way home and down into my sleep. The second warning came from my own best friend Steph, who had been my maid of honor since we were 14, who loved me fiercely, and who also spent a truly impressive number of her evenings reading online forums about terrible mothers-in-law. She meant well. She always meant well. But she'd text me at 11 at night some stranger's horror story about a woman who'd hijacked a wedding or moved herself uninvited into the guest room with a message underneath that just said, "Protect your peace, Rach." And I'd lie in the dark reading them, feeling the thin walls of my careful little life get a little thinner. And the third warning, the loudest one, came from inside me, where it always does. Because when you have taught yourself since 17 that mothers are people you lose, the idea of walking straight into a new one was its own kind of terror. I didn't just expect Iris to be cruel. Some cold, buried part of me almost needed her to be. Because a cruel mother-in-law, I knew how to survive. A kind one, a real one, was the thing I had no armor for at all. By the time I was finally supposed to meet her, I had built Iris in my mind into something enormous. I had given her 100 faces, and not one of them was gentle. I had rehearsed entire conversations in the shower, out loud. I had a plan ready for the passive comment about my cooking, A plan for the sideways remark about my family, about my empty side of the church. A plan for the exact moment she would look me over and find me wanting. I walked into that woman's kitchen armored to the teeth for a war she had absolutely no idea I had declared. And this is the part I need you to hold on to, because it's the whole hinge of everything that follows. When you go into a room certain that someone is your enemy, you will find your evidence. You will find it in a plain sentence. You will find it in a silence. You will read a quiet, tired, careful woman like a loaded gun, and every gentle thing she does will look, through all that armor, like the setup for a trap. I made a casserole to bring to that first supper, and I want you to know how much thought went into that casserole, because it tells you the whole state of my mind. I stood in the grocery store for a solid half hour, choosing between two kinds of cheese, like the marriage depended on it. I made the whole thing twice. And on the long drive out to their place, I held it warm on my lap the entire way, both hands gripping the dish through the towel like a shield, rehearsing exactly what I would say when she looked down at it and found it wanting. That casserole was not supper. It was armor with a lid on it. Iris lived with her husband Walt in a low brick house at the end of a gravel road, with a garden out back that ran nearly to the tree line, and an old red hound named Buddy, who slept on the porch in a patch of sun. It was late summer the first time I saw the place, and I remember the light going gold over the tomatoes, and a long bed of tall flowers running along the fence, purple and blue and gold, standing up straight in the evening heat. Irises, of course, row after row of them. I didn't know yet that her mother had planted the very first of them 50 years before, or that Iris herself had been named for them, or that she had been dividing and moving those same roots her whole life so that a piece of her mother's garden traveled with her to every house she ever lived in. That evening I just saw flowers, and thought, of course, even the yard is trying too hard to impress me. That's how far gone I was. I stood in front of a garden that was really an act of love 50 years long, and I read it as a performance. She met us at the door in an apron with flour on it, and she did not hug me. That was the first piece of evidence, and I filed it away. She took the warm casserole dish out of my hands with both of hers, like it was something that mattered, and told me it would go just right with supper. And I stood there on the mat, not knowing what on earth to do with being thanked for a thing I had made as a shield. She looked at me for a long moment then, really looked, the way my grandmother used to, study fruit at the market. And she said, "So, you're Rachel." Not warm, not cold, just true, like she was confirming something. And I felt myself go small and defensive down to my shoes, and I thought, here it comes. Dinner was quiet. Iris didn't rush to fill the silences the way anxious people do, the way I always do. She let them sit, comfortable in them. She asked me 3 or 4 direct questions about my work, about my people, about where I'd grown up. And when I gave her the short, careful answers I gave everyone, she didn't push, but she didn't pretend either. When I mentioned, as lightly as I could manage, that my mother had passed when I was young, she didn't gasp, or reach across for my hand, or tell me she was so sorry. She just went still for a second. She nodded, slow, and she said, "That's a hard thing to lose early," and passed me the biscuits. I took that stillness as coldness. I want to be honest with you about how completely I misread her, because I misread her in nearly every way a person can. That flat, quiet, "that's a hard thing to lose early," was the single most understanding thing anyone had said to me about my mother in 12 years. No performance, no flinching away. Just one true sentence from someone who plainly knew the weight of the thing. And I sat there at her table and decided it was proof that she didn't care. The biscuits, though. I have to tell you about the biscuits. They were the best thing I had ever put in my mouth in my life. Tall and craggy and gold, steam coming up out of the middle when I split one, and it hit some old buried memory of my mother's kitchen so hard that I must have made a sound, because Iris looked up. And for just a second, something crossed her face that I couldn't name back then. I can name it now. It was hope. It was a woman with an empty seat in her life, watching to see whether the girl her son loved was the kind who noticed a good biscuit. "My mother's recipe," she said, and looked back down at her plate. "Nothing to it if you don't overwork the dough." And she left it there, and I went right back to my armor, and Ben squeezed my knee under the table because he thought the whole thing was going beautifully. He was right, and I couldn't see it yet. We drove home that night, and Ben asked me what I thought, and I said she seemed nice, in the flat little voice you use when you mean the exact opposite. And he was quiet for a mile of dark road. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "My mom doesn't hand her heart to strangers. She had a hard time a few years back. A real hard time. Give her a season. She grows on you slow, like everything worth having." I nodded and looked out the window at the black hills sliding by, and I thought, a hard time, sure, they all have a hard time. That's just what people say about difficult women, to explain them. I filed it away as an excuse. It was the first real clue anyone handed me, and I stepped right over the top of it. The next months were a slow, strange dance, and the strangest part of the dance was that Iris kept on not being the monster I had built. Every single time I braced myself for the blow, something soft landed instead. And here is the thing nobody warns you about. When you are certain the blow is coming, the softness doesn't feel like relief. It feels like suspicion. It feels like a trick you haven't figured out yet. When she found out I was living alone in a drafty apartment, a set of curtains showed up. Hand-sewn, thick and flannel-lined, with a note that just said, "For the north window. That one lets the cold right in." No fuss, no fishing around for a thank you. I stood in my little kitchen holding them and thought, what does she want from me? When my car died 2 days before Christmas, and I was too proud to say so to anyone, Walt somehow showed up in his old truck to follow me to the shop and wait. When I tried to wave him off, he just shrugged in his soft, mumbling way and said, "Iris sent me. You don't argue with Iris." And he sat in that cold waiting room for 3 hours, doing a crossword puzzle in pen. And he asked me nothing. And he let me be quiet. And I sat there beside him thinking, why? Why are these people doing this? I want to stop right here and say something to you, because maybe you have been the one holding the flannel curtains, not knowing what on earth to do with a kindness that doesn't come with a bill attached. When you have taught yourself for years that love is a thing that gets taken back, a person being steadily, quietly good to you does not feel like safety. It feels like a debt you can't yet see the size of. It feels like standing under something heavy. I spent months waiting for Iris to name her price. The whole time, her only price was that I would stay long enough to let her love me. There's a small thing from that fall I only understood much later, and it tells you exactly who she was. Business at the nursery had been slow, and I'd mentioned it once, in passing, the way you mention things you don't expect anyone to do anything about. And then, over a few weeks, a steady trickle of older women started coming in, asking for me by name, saying Iris from the garden club had sent them, that she said I was the only one in 3 counties who'd tell them the truth about their soil. She never said a word to me about it. She just quietly pointed her whole world in my direction and let me think I'd earned it on my own. That was her love. It never announced itself. It just showed up and got to work and left before you could thank it. The thing that finally cracked me open, though, happened at the first Thanksgiving. I have gone back to that one day more times than I could ever count. If you take away only one scene from everything I'm telling you tonight, let it be that crowded kitchen and the thing my mother-in-law did in it without a soul having to ask her. I almost didn't go. I had worked myself into knots about it for weeks. A whole houseful of Ben's relatives, all of them, I was sure, lined up to look me over and find the girl marrying in to be lacking. Brittany would be there. So would the blunt Aunt Diane, who Ben had warned me, says exactly what she thinks and thinks a great deal of it. I packed up all my armor and I went anyway. For Ben. And for the first hour, it was fine. Better than fine. It was warm, the house full of steam and noise, and the good chaos of far too many people crowded into one kitchen. Buddy, the old hound, weaving underfoot, hoping for a dropped scrap. A football game murmuring in the other room that nobody was really watching. Iris kept me at her side by the stove almost the whole time. Not to show me off, just to hand me things and to show me things, low and steady, underneath all the noise. Taste that. Needs more salt? You decide. Your mouth's as good as mine. I remember being genuinely amazed that she would trust me that close to the food. Then Aunt Diane, 2 glasses of wine in, said the thing. She said it lightly, the way people say cruel things lightly so they can call it a joke later if you flinch. She looked at me across the counter, in a lull in the noise, and she said, "So, Rachel, no family of your own coming to any of this? Just us to fill up your side of the aisle come spring? Lord, honey, that is going to be a lonesome-looking half of the church." The kitchen went a little quiet. I felt my face go hot. Felt myself drop straight back to 17. Felt the old familiar shame of being the girl with the empty side of everything. And I opened my mouth to say some small apologetic thing to smooth it all over and make everybody comfortable again, the way I always did. But Iris got there first. She set down the wooden spoon she was holding. She didn't raise her voice. She never once raised her voice in all the years I got to know her. She just looked across the counter at her sister-in-law and said, clear enough for the whole room to catch it, "Rachel's side of the church is going to be full, Diane. It's going to be full of us. That is what a family is. It isn't who you happen to get born to. It's who stands up when they call your name." A beat. "Now handy that dish towel before this pan boils clean over." And just like that, the moment was gone, folded right back into the noise and the steam, and Aunt Diane found something very interesting to study at the bottom of her wine glass. And the football game murmured on, and Iris stirred her pan like nothing at all had happened. I had to go and stand in the bathroom for a few minutes. I ran the water so nobody would hear me. Because no one had stood up for me like that since my mother died. Not my father, not a boss, not a friend, not a boyfriend. No one in 12 years. And it had come from the one woman I had spent an entire year deciding was my enemy. Thrown down casual as a dish towel, like defending me was just the plain obvious thing. The boiling over thing you handle without needing to be asked twice. Later that night, when most everyone had gone home and the kitchen was down to just the 2 of us and a mountain of dishes, I found the box. It was a dented tin recipe box, cream-colored, with faded roses painted on the lid, sitting open on the counter where she'd pulled the dressing card from it that morning. While she ran a pan of hot water in the sink, I flipped idly through the cards inside, and I noticed something I hadn't before. They were written in 3 different hands. Most were in a spidery, old-fashioned script, the brown ink gone pale with age, and I guessed those belonged to her mother. A good many were in Iris's own square, practical print. But scattered all through the box were maybe a dozen cards in a third hand entirely, round and looping and young, the handwriting of a teenager, with little hearts dotting the i's, and a grease stain or two. Snickerdoodles, friendship bread. One card that just said, in that round young hand, "Mom's biscuits, the right way. Don't let her rush you." I asked, without thinking, "Whose handwriting is this?" I felt the whole room change before she even answered. Walt, drying a glass by the window, went very still. And Iris kept her hands down in the dishwater and her eyes on the dark window over the sink. And after a moment she said, quiet and even, "That's Annie's, our daughter, Ben's little sister." I hadn't known Ben had a sister. In a whole year, not one single person in that family had said her name in front of me. Some griefs go so deep that a family just quietly builds the whole house around them and learns to walk soft past the one closed door. "She'd be 29 now," Iris said in that same level voice, the one I'd mistaken for coldness 100 times over. "She got sick when she was 17, and we lost her when she was 19. Leukemia. It was quick at the very end, and it was not quick at all, if that makes any sense to you." She wrung the cloth out slow. "She loved this kitchen. She used to sit right up there on that counter and copy her grandmother's cards out in her own hand so we wouldn't ever lose them. Said someday she'd cook for her own family off of them." A small breath. "So I keep the box." 17. She got sick at 17, the same age I was when I lost my mother. I didn't say that out loud, but I felt it land in the room between us like a stone dropped in still water, the rings of it going out and out. And I stood there in that warm kitchen with a dish towel in my hands, and every single thing I had gotten wrong about this woman rearranged itself in front of me, all at once, quiet and total, like a whole flock of birds turning in the air at the same instant. The stillness when I said I'd lost my mother. She hadn't been indifferent. She had been someone who knew exactly to the marrow what that particular loss weighs, and who'd had the grace not to make my grief perform for her. The way she never handed her heart to strangers. The famous falling out with Brittany years back. The great proof that Iris was a monster. I would learn the true shape of that one later, and it was so human it made my chest ache. It had happened during Annie's last bad winter, when Iris was hollowed all the way out with fear and no sleep. And Brittany, who wasn't cruel, just careless, had said something at a family dinner about how Iris was letting herself go and needed to get back to normal soon. And Iris, for once in her life, had not stayed quiet and swallowed it. She'd said something sharp and final and terribly true, right there at the table. And Brittany had never forgiven the sharpness of it, and had spent the years since telling anyone who'd listened that Iris was cold, was cruel, was a lot. That was the monster. A mother in the very worst season of her life, snapping one single time at someone who had wandered too close to the open wound. The entire terrifying legend I'd been handed, the thing that kept me up at night, was built on one bad hour in the middle of the unthinkable. And I had believed all of it. I had let strangers on the internet and a woman by a drinks table tell me exactly who Iris was. And I had marched into her home, ready to defend myself against a grieving mother who'd done nothing but open her kitchen, her mother's recipes, and her flannel curtains to the lonely girl her son brought home. I didn't say any of that. I couldn't have gotten a single word out. I just picked up a fresh towel and I stood next to her at that sink, and I dried every dish she washed, the two of us not talking. The window gone black, and the house ticking as it cooled around us. And something passed between us in that quiet that was bigger than anything I could have said out loud. When we finally finished, she looked at the clean, bare counter, and then she looked at me, and she said, "You dry a dish like you mean it. That's rarer than you'd think." And I laughed, wet-faced and caught off guard, and she almost smiled. And I drove home that night and cried the whole way. But it was a different crying than the drive home after that first dinner. It was the kind that lets something out of you instead of the kind that holds it in. After that night, I stopped waiting for the blow, because I finally understood down in my bones that there wasn't one coming. And the strangest, sweetest thing happened, which is that the moment I set the armor down, the entire world Iris had been holding out to me the whole time was simply there, like a warm lit room I'd been standing outside of in the cold. And all I had ever had to do was walk in. She started teaching me to cook, really teaching me, not showing off. The slow, patient way you teach someone you fully intend to keep around. The biscuits first, of course, because those were the ones that mattered most. "You're not company anymore," she said the first time, tying a spare apron on me from a hook by the stove. A soft, faded one that I understood only much later had been Annie's. "Company sits down and lets you wait on them. Family washes their hands and gets to work. Now, don't work that dough. You work it, you'll turn out a hockey puck. You want to just barely bring it together and leave it lumpy and scared looking. Trust it to be enough." She rapped her knuckles on the counter. "You'll know it came out right by how little you had to do to it." I made hockey pucks for a solid month. She never once let me feel foolish about a single one of them. She'd just eat one anyway, butter and all, and say, "Better than last week," even the weeks when it plainly was not, and hand me the flour bag again. And there was a whole language in it I was only starting to learn. That this was how she said the tender things. Not with speeches, with flour on your hands, and one more chance, and better than last week. I hadn't cooked, not really, since I was 17. I told you that. 12 years of cereal and toast because I couldn't stand in a kitchen and make something real without my mother in it. And here was this woman who had no idea about any of that, quietly handing that whole part of me back, a spoonful at a time, on a random Sunday, in an apron that had belonged to the daughter she'd buried. Neither of us ever said what was really happening. We didn't have to. Two women who had each lost the person they were supposed to be doing this with, standing at a counter, doing it together anyway. That winter, the first one after I'd met his family, I came down with a flu that flattened me. The kind where you lose a whole week and the fever makes the ceiling swim. I didn't call anybody. Of course I didn't. Not leaning was the one skill I had truly mastered. But Ben must have mentioned it, because on the second day, there was a knock. And there stood Iris, on my doorstep, with a pot of soup, a sleeve of crackers, and no intention whatsoever of being turned away. She didn't fuss over me. She just set the soup on to warm, changed my sweated-through sheets while I sat wrapped in a blanket too weak to argue, and settled into the chair by my bed with her crossword until I fell asleep. When I woke, it was full dark and she was gone, and the soup was in the fridge in labeled containers, and my fever had broken, and I lay there in the clean, cool sheets and understood, finally, that this was what it was supposed to feel like. This was the thing I'd been missing all along and calling independence. The seasons turned, and she taught me by all of them. High summer, we put up peach preserves, a whole sweltering afternoon of it, the kitchen thick with steam and sugar, jars lined up on the sill catching the light like little lamps. She made 4 times more than any 2 households could ever eat, and I finally understood why. Because she sent me home with an armful and told me to give the rest away. And I saw at last that the too much was the entire point. It was love in a form you could hand across a fence to a neighbor. In the fall, we did apple butter, stirring the same pot for hours, taking turns, talking about nothing and everything. She told me stories about Annie in those long stirring hours. Easy now, the way you can talk about the dead once someone has let you know they're allowed to be spoken of. She told me once, stirring the apple butter slow, about the time a 9-year-old Annie had tried to make her grandmother's biscuits as a surprise and used a whole cup of salt in place of the sugar, and how the entire family had eaten them anyway, straight-faced, every last one, so as not to hurt her feelings, until Annie figured it out from their watering eyes and laughed till she cried. Iris laughed telling it, really laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from her before. And then she went quiet and stirred a while. And I understood that letting the good memories back in was its own kind of brave, and that she was practicing it slowly, out loud, with me. It was the first time I understood that I wasn't only being handed a family, I was being trusted with one. One evening, late that first spring, she handed me a shovel instead of a spoon. We walked out to the long bed along the fence, and she showed me how to lift a clump of the irises without tearing the roots, how to split the thick-knuckled rhizomes apart and shake the dirt loose. "You take these home," she said, "and you put them where they'll catch the morning sun, and in a year or 2, you'll have your own." I told her I didn't have a yard yet, just the apartment. She waved that clean away. "Then you keep them in a pot till you do. The point is, you've got a piece of the garden now. My mother started these. Her mother before her. In a yard I never even saw. This is how they travel." I planted them the day Ben and I bought our little house, along our own back fence, and every spring since, they have come up purple and blue and gold. A piece of a garden 50 years deep, carried forward in the trunk of my car on an ordinary Tuesday. If you're still with me tonight, and it's all right if your eyes have already gone closed, let me just say this softly, and then keep right on going. There are more of these quiet stories waiting for you whenever the dark gets long. So let this one carry you as far as it can. But stay here in Iris's warm kitchen with me just a little longer. We're almost to the wedding, and the wedding is where I stop being afraid for good. Spring came, and the irises came up along the fence the way they always did, purple and blue and gold, and my wedding came up right along with them. And a wedding, if you've ever been through one, has a way of finding the exact place where a person hurts and pressing its thumb right down on it. For me, that place had a shape and a name. It was the mother of the bride shape, the empty one, the seat and the dance and the hands doing up the back of your dress, all those small, quiet rituals that belong to a mother. And I had spent months dreading every one of them, because I had always assumed I'd be doing them alone. I never once asked Iris for any of it. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me that you know. I was still too proud, still too used to not leaning, to ever have asked her for a thing. She never waited to be asked. That was simply never her way. The week before the wedding, a small box arrived at my apartment, and inside it, folded in tissue, was a handkerchief. old and soft and edged with careful handmade lace, gone a little yellow with age, and a note in Iris's square print. This was my mother's, and it was Annie's when she was small. Something old, if you'll have it. Tuck it into your bouquet. Nobody has to know it's there but us. I sat down on my kitchen floor and I wept. And this time I understood exactly what I was being handed. And it was not a debt. It was a door being held open by a woman who knew, better than almost anyone alive, what it was to have empty hands on a big day, and who had decided, long before I ever came close to earning it, that mine would not be empty. My father did come to the wedding. I'd sent the invitation half sure he wouldn't, and he surprised me, drove the 4 hours and sat in the front pew in a suit I'd never seen. And he hugged me, stiff and careful at the reception, and told me I looked like my mother, which was the kindest thing he knew how to say, and cost him something to get out. And then he left before the dancing, the way he always left everything. A good man, simply worn too thin by an old grief to stay in a loud, bright room for long. I made my peace with that a while ago. He gave me what he had. It just wasn't much. And it never would be. And Iris, standing there filling the gap, didn't erase him. It just meant the gap stopped being a cold wind blowing through the middle of my life. On the morning of the wedding, Iris came early, before anyone, before even Steph, and she did up the long row of buttons on the back of my dress with her steady, practical hands. She met my eyes in the mirror when she was done, and neither of us said a word for a second, because we both knew perfectly well whose job this was supposed to be, and whose job it had quietly, without anyone deciding it, become. Then she smoothed my shoulders down and said, "You'll do," which from Iris was a whole symphony, and she tucked the handkerchief into my flowers with her own hands. Steph got there a little later, my Steph, who had sent me every single one of those midnight horror stories. And she stopped dead in the doorway when she saw Iris fixing the fall of my veil. She didn't say anything for a second. Then she came over and hugged me too tight and whispered into my hair, "I had her all wrong, didn't I?" And I felt her not quite crying against my shoulder. She had meant every warning as love. That's the thing about the people who hand you the fear. Most of them truly believe they are handing you a shield. Steph danced with Walt twice that night and cried at all the toasts, and she has never once sent me a horror story since. There was no mother-daughter dance printed on the program. I hadn't been able to bear the thought of putting one there. But late in the evening, when the band was playing something slow, and half the room was swaying together in the low light, Iris found me standing by the cake, and she didn't make any speech of it, and she didn't call for a spotlight. She just held out her hand and tipped her head toward the floor. An ordinary invitation. No announcement, no eyes on us. And we danced, the two of us, right in the middle of everybody else. Not as any kind of performance, just as two women who had each lost the person they were meant to be dancing with, holding on tight to the one who had shown up instead. She didn't say she loved me. Iris almost never said it in so many words. But when the song wound down, she held my face in her two flower-worn hands for just a moment, and she looked at me the exact way she looked at me on that very first evening in her doorway. Really looked. All the way in. And this time, I let her. And standing there, I finally understood that being seen like that, all the way through, was the one thing I had been starving for and running from my entire life, both at the same time. Ben found the two of us and wrapped his arms around us both, and over the top of my head, I heard him say to his mother, thick-voiced, "Thank you." And I heard her say back, brisk, brushing hard at her eyes with the back of her wrist, "Oh, stop that. Somebody had to. Go on and dance with your wife." We settled into a life after that, an ordinary good one, and Iris was stitched all the way through it. Sunday dinners at the brick house, Buddy asleep under the table on everybody's feet. Jars of her peach preserves lined up in my pantry, always more than we could eat, so I started giving them away over my own fence, and finally became a person who made too much on purpose. I called her about scorched sauces and clogged gutters, and, one night at 2 in the morning, about a fight with Ben I couldn't see my own way out of. She didn't take my side, and she didn't take his. She just told me, gentle, one true small thing about her own son that only a mother would ever know, and it saved us a whole week of stubbornness in a single sentence. The next Thanksgiving, I cooked. All of it, in my own kitchen, with Iris sitting at my table as a guest for once, her hands folded in her lap, being waited on for a change. My biscuits came out tall and craggy and gold, and she split one and looked at it a long moment and set it back down and didn't say a single word. She just reached across and squeezed my wrist once, and that squeeze said everything a speech would only have ruined. I don't remember deciding to call her Mom. That's the honest truth of it. There wasn't a moment, no big scene, no permission asked for or granted. It simply started coming out of my mouth one perfectly ordinary afternoon, over the phone. "Okay, Mom, love you, bye." The way a thing comes out once it's quietly become true, and your heart has run out ahead of your head. And there was the smallest pause on the line, and then she said, "Love you too, honey. You drive safe." Like she'd been waiting a very long time to have somebody to say that to, and had very nearly given up on the chance of it ever coming. I promised you an ending, and I mean to give it to you the way it deserves, so settle all the way in for the last of it, and let it be the last thing you hold before you sleep. Here's what happened next. This is the part I still can't quite tell without my voice going on me. 4 years after the wedding, Ben and I had a baby, a daughter. She came in the spring, small and furious and perfect, with her father's easy calm and, heaven help every last one of us, my own stubborn chin. And we brought her home, to a house full of flowers. Because Iris had gone out and cut every last iris from along that fence line, and filled every jar we owned, and a few we didn't. We had not told a single soul the name we'd chosen. We'd kept it wrapped up tight between just the two of us. A small, good secret we were saving for exactly this. When Iris came to hold her granddaughter for the very first time, she lowered herself into the old rocker by the window with that brand new weight settled in her arms. 68 years old now, her hands not quite as sure as they'd been the morning of my buttons. She looked down into that tiny crumpled face for a long while. And then she said, soft, barely above the hum of the room, "Well, hello there. And what is it we're going to call you, little one?" And I said, "We're going to call her Iris." She didn't say anything at all. She just lifted her head and looked at me, and her whole face came apart, quiet as everything she had ever done, the tears just running down without a single sound. She pulled that baby in a little closer and pressed her lips to the top of her small, warm head. And after a long moment, she whispered, "Oh no, that's too much." That's far, far too much. And I got down on my knees beside the rocker and put my hand over her hand, over the baby. And I said the truest thing I have ever said to another living person. I said, "You are not too much. You never were. That was always a lie, and I'm sorry I ever believed a word of it, even for a single day. You are exactly enough. You are the mother I lost. Come back to me the long way around." She's older now, my Iris. She moves slower these days, and she doesn't drive after dark anymore. And she has taught my daughter to make hockey pucks in that same warm kitchen, tying Annie's soft old apron around a giggling 5-year-old and telling her, dead serious, "Don't you work that dough, you trust it. You'll know it came out right by how little you had to do to it." And last month, on my little Iris's 5th birthday, my mother-in-law reached up and took the dented tin recipe box down from the shelf where it had lived as long as there had been a family to feed. And she set it in my 2 hands, and she said, "It's yours now. You keep the box. You add your own cards to it. That's the only way it stays alive." And I opened the lid, and I found that she had already slipped a new card into the very front, in her square, practical print, and it read, "For Rachel. Who dries a dish like she means it? Welcome home. It only took you the 1 season." Even Brittany and Iris made a quiet peace in the end. It wasn't any kind of scene. One Thanksgiving a few years on, I watched Brittany hand Iris a dish across the counter, and Iris say, "Thank you," plain and real, and the 2 of them stand side by side at that stove for a while, not saying much. And that was that. Grief makes people say hard things they can't take back. Time, if you'll let it, lets them set the hard things down. Nobody in that kitchen was ever really a monster. That, in the end, was the whole thing I had gotten wrong. So that is the woman I was so afraid of. That is the monster I braced myself against for the better part of a year. Everyone warned me. My friend with her midnight screenshots, the cousin's wife by the drinks table, the whole loud, confident world of stories about women who only ever take and take and take. And every single one of them was wrong. Because every one of them was reading a grieving mother's guarded quiet as cruelty. The very same mistake I nearly made. The mistake that nearly cost me the best thing that has ever happened to me. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry off into sleep with you tonight, it's just this small thing, and I'll say it gentle. Be careful about the stories other people hand you about a person you haven't even met yet. Fear is a very convincing liar. It speaks in a reasonable voice. Sometimes the woman everyone told you to watch out for is only a heart that got broken clean in 2 once, and learned after that to knock quietly before it ever opened again. And sometimes, if you can find the nerve to set the heavy armor down and stay just 1 more season, the very thing you spent so long bracing yourself against turns out to be the thing you were looking for the whole time. Iris is asleep in the next room as I tell you all this. Come to stay a few nights, her granddaughter curled in against her side, the 2 of them breathing slow and even in the dark. Buddy is long gone now, but there's a younger dog on the porch these days, keeping his own watch. The recipe box is sitting on my counter with the light switched off above it. The flannel curtains she sewed are still hanging on the north window, still keeping the cold right out where it belongs. And somewhere along the fence line, down under the cold spring ground, the roots of her mother's flowers are quietly getting ready to come up again. Purple and blue and gold the way they always do, the way the good and steady things do, whether or not you ever once learned to expect them. Before you drift all the way off, let me ask you something, and you can answer it in the quiet, or in the morning, or never at all. Was there ever someone in your own life you braced yourself hard against, dead sure they were going to hurt you, who turned out to be exactly the person you needed most? I'd truly love to know, and I'm always curious what corner of the world is lying awake and listening along with me tonight. So if you feel like it, leave your state and your age down below. It helps these small, quiet stories find the other people out there in the dark who might need one. Rest now. Let the house tick and settle and cool around you. You don't have to keep watch tonight. Some doors, it turns out, were only ever going to open. Sleep well, and I'll see you, soft and low, in the next one.